Good evening, traveler. I'm the Midnight Rider, and you've tuned in to Channel 19 Mysteries. We like to think we've conquered the world. We build roads, we map the wilderness with satellites, and we tell ourselves that the age of monsters is over. But there's a place in New South Wales, Australia, where that confidence goes to die. They call it the Blue Mountains. From the tourist lookouts, it's a painting of endless eucalyptus and hazy blue ridges. But if you step off the path, if you go down into the crushing density of the Jameson or Grose Valleys, the painting turns into a prison. Tonight, we aren't just talking about campfires and folklore. We are talking about biological reality. We're looking at the files of men like Rex Gilroy, who stared into the eyes of a massive, hairy predator at the ruined castle and realized we aren't at the top of the food chain. We're going to whisper about Neil Frost, a man who didn't just see these creatures but lived under siege by them, tormented by a giant known only as Fatfoot. And we'll join a camper named Dave in the pitch black, listening to a creature that didn't just stalk him, it mimicked him. The Dooligahl, the hairy man, the Yowie, whatever you call it, it owns the night in these mountains. Before we step into the tree line, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell. You don't want to be left alone in the dark when the next video drops. And let me know in the comments, do you believe some valleys are better left unexplored? Now, let's get into tonight's stories. Terrifying stories of the Australian Yowie. If you are a fan of the unexplained, of stories that make you question what is really watching you from the tree line when you think you are alone, then you have come to the right place. Tonight's stories take us to one of the most rugged, beautiful, and deceptively dangerous places on Earth, the Blue Mountains of New South Wales, Australia. When you look at the Blue Mountains from a distance, they look serene. A haze of blue, caused by the dispersion of volatile oils from the eucalyptus trees, hangs over the valleys. It looks like a painting. But if you zoom in, if you go down from the tourist lookouts at Katoomba and Echo Point, down past the Three Sisters, and into the dense, tangled scrub of the valley floor, the painting changes. It becomes a green prison. The terrain here is brutal. It is a labyrinth of sandstone cliffs, slot canyons that have never seen the sun, and forests so thick that a person can vanish 10 meters from the track and never be seen again. It is a place that feels ancient, a place that feels like it doesn't want you there. And for centuries, the people who have lived here, from the Gundungurra and Darug people to the early European settlers, to the modern residents of towns like Springwood and Hazelbrook, have told stories of something else that lives here. Something that walks on two legs, something that screams in the night, something that is neither human nor animal. They call it the Yowie. Most people think of the Yowie as a joke, a campfire story to scare tourists. But for the people we are going to talk about today, real people with real names, whose lives were fundamentally altered by what they saw, the Yowie is not a joke, it is a biological reality. It is a flesh and blood nightmare that woke them up in the middle of the night, that stalked them through the scrub, and that made them realize that we are not the apex predators we think we are. These are the true stories of the Blue Mountains Yowie. To understand what Neil Frost and Rex Gilroy experienced, we first have to understand that they were not the first. They were just the latest in a long line of terrified witnesses. Roll back the clock to the late 19th century. The Blue Mountains were still being tamed. Men were carving roads out of the sandstone, sinking mines into the valleys, and trying to turn the harsh scrub into farmland. And almost immediately, they started running into resistance. In the archives of the Katoomba Times and other colonial newspapers, you don't find stories about Bigfoot. You find stories about the Yowie, or the hairy man. There was a palpable fear in the isolated homesteads that dotted the ridgelines. It wasn't just a fear of getting lost or snake bites. It was a fear of being watched. One particular account from the Megalong Valley in the 1890s describes a settler who was riding his horse home at dusk. The Megalong is a deep, bowl-like valley surrounded by towering cliffs. As the sun dips below the escarpment, the light fails quickly. The settler's horse, a beast usually calm under fire, suddenly froze. It refused to move. Its ears were pinned back, its eyes rolling in its head. The settler kicked the flanks, urged it on, but the horse began to tremble violently. Then, from the dense tea tree scrub at the side of the track, a rock the size of a man's head came sailing through the air. It didn't hit the settler, but it landed with a heavy thud on the path in front of him. This wasn't a pebble kicked up by a wallaby. This was a missile. The settler looked into the gloom. Standing there, just at the edge of visibility, was a figure. It was upright. It was massive, described as being broad across the shoulders as a bullock. It was covered in dark matted hair, and it was growling. Not the high-pitched screech of a koala or the howl of a dingo, but a low, chest-vibrating rumble that the settler could feel in his own saddle. He didn't wait to see more. He wheeled the horse around and galloped back the way he came, terrified. When he returned the next day with a group of men and rifles, they found nothing but crushed undergrowth and footprints human-like, but massive, with toes that splayed out wide, gripping the mud. This wasn't an isolated incident. In 1903, the Australian Town and Country Journal reported on the Heathen Man, a wild, hairy figure seen roaming the remote gullies. The indigenous elders of the time, men like Old Bungaree, had tried to warn the white settlers. They spoke of the Dooligahl and the Gindering. They said these beings were the original owners of the land, powerful spirits that could take physical form, or perhaps flesh and blood tribes that had retreated into the deepest canyons to escape the encroachment of civilization. But the settlers didn't listen. They laughed it off until the rocks started flying, until their dogs disappeared, until they saw the dark shape standing by the woodpile in the moonlight. The terror was real enough that mothers would threaten their children, not with the bogeyman, but with the Yowie. Be good, or the hairy man will take you. It was a warning born of specific, localized incidents. Fast forward to the 20th century. The horse and cart have been replaced by the Holden station wagon, but the Blue Mountains are just as wild. Enter Rex Gilroy. If you look up the Yowie today, you will find Rex Gilroy's name. He passed away recently, but for 50 years, he was the driving force behind Australian cryptozoology. He was eccentric, obsessive, and absolutely convinced that Australia was home to a relict hominid population. But he didn't start that way. He needed a catalyst. He needed to see it for himself. The date was August 7th, 1970. The location? The ruined castle. The ruined castle is a spectacular rock formation in the Jameson Valley. To get there, you have to hike down the Golden Stairs, a steep, punishing descent, and then trek through kilometers of tall forest. It is isolated. In 1970, it was even more so. Rex was hiking alone. He was a naturalist, collecting insect specimens, looking for anything interesting. The bush was quiet, too quiet. If you spend enough time in the Australian bush, you know the rhythm of the noise. The cicadas, the whipbirds, the rustle of lizards. When that noise stops, it means a predator is nearby. Rex reached a clearing near the rock formation. He stopped. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. It's that primal instinct, the feeling of being hunted. He looked across the clearing, and there it was. Rex later described the creature as standing about 6 feet tall, not a giant, but incredibly broad. It was covered in reddish-brown hair. It didn't look like a gorilla, and it didn't look like a human. It had no neck. Its head seemed to sit directly on its massive shoulders. Its brow was heavy, shading its eyes. It wasn't hiding. It was standing there, watching him. For a moment, time froze. Rex, the man who would spend the next 5 decades hunting this thing, was paralyzed. He wasn't thinking about plaster casts or cameras. He was thinking about survival. The creature made a noise, a grunt, that sounded surprised and then turned. It didn't run like a man. It moved with a fluid, loping gait, tearing through the scrub with terrifying speed. It crashed through the undergrowth, snapping branches that would take a human 10 minutes to saw through. Rex didn't chase it. Not then. He got out of there. But that moment lit a fire in him. He realized that the Yowie of the Colonial newspapers wasn't a myth. It was an animal, a biological reality. He began to collect stories. He and his wife, Heather, turned their home in Katoomba into a museum. They collected thousands of reports. They found footprints in the mud that measured 14 inches long and 6 inches wide. They found crude stone tools that didn't match Aboriginal craftsmanship. But Rex was often dismissed by the scientific community. They called him a dreamer. They said he was seeing wallabies and calling them monsters. But the people who came to Rex, the truck drivers, the campers, the farmers, they weren't dreamers. They were traumatized, and they had nowhere else to go. They would arrive at his museum, shaking, recounting stories of cars being run off the road, of massive hairy hands reaching through open windows, of screams that sounded like a woman being murdered, echoing from the bottom of the cliffs. Rex gave them a voice, and he gave the creature a name that stuck: the Yowie. While Rex Gilroy was the public face of the Yowie, operating a museum and talking to the press, something much darker and more intimate was happening to a man named Neil Frost. Neil Frost wasn't looking for fame. He wasn't a monster hunter in the traditional sense. He was a resident of the lower Blue Mountains, a man who lived on the edge of the bush. He wanted to live a quiet life. But the bush had other plans. Neil's story is unique because it wasn't just a single sighting. It was a relationship. It was a siege. Neil lived in a house that backed directly onto the dense bushland. For years, he and his neighbors had noticed strange things. It started with small annoyances: garbage bins turned over, strange whistles coming from the tree line at night, the family dogs barking at nothing, their hackles raised, refusing to go into the backyard. Most people would write this off. Possums, foxes, maybe a stray dog. But then the activity escalated. One evening, Neil was at home. It was dark outside. The Blue Mountains at night are pitch black. There are no streetlights in the deep bush. He was sitting in his living room, reading, when he heard a sound that didn't make sense. It was a heavy, rhythmic thumping. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like a bipedal walker, a heavy one. He went to the window and peered out. The light from the house spilled a few meters onto the lawn, but beyond that, it was a wall of black. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel it. He felt that same heavy dread that the settler in the Megalong Valley had felt 100 years earlier. Over the next few months, Neil and a small group of trusted neighbors and researchers, a group they eventually called the Octopus because of their network of information, began to document what was happening. They weren't dealing with ghosts. They were dealing with a troop of animals. Neil identified 3 distinct types of creatures operating in the area. This is where his account gets incredibly detailed and disturbing. First, there were the Junjudee. These were small, about 3 to 4 feet tall. They were dark, quick, and almost monkey-like. A neighbor of Neil's, a woman who lived nearby, had a terrifying encounter with one of these. She had walked into her kitchen at night and turned on the outside light. Pressed up against the glass of her sliding door, staring right at her, was a small, gnome-like face. It had dark skin, deep-set eyes, and it was cupping its hands against the glass to see inside. It wasn't a child. It was something else. When she screamed, it vanished into the night. Then, there were the quinkon. These were taller, leaner, and more aggressive. They were the ones who would throw rocks. They were the ones who seemed to enjoy tormenting the dogs. But the one that changed Neil's life, the one that he developed a strange, terrifying respect for, was a massive male he nicknamed Fatfoot. Fatfoot was a Dooligahl. He was huge. He stood over 7 feet tall. He was built like a tank, and he was the king of that patch of bush. Neil's interactions with Fatfoot went beyond simple sightings. Neil began to leave food out. He began to try to communicate. He wanted to prove that these things existed, but he also wanted to understand them. One night, Neil was camping out on his property, trying to get photographic evidence. He was in a tent, lying awake, listening. He heard the heavy footsteps approaching. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. Neil lay there, barely breathing. He could hear the creature breathing a deep, wet, rasping sound. He could smell it. Witnesses almost always mention the smell. It's a mix of rotting garbage, wet dog, and something musky and chemical, like a wombat, but 1,000 times stronger. Then, a massive hand pressed against the side of the tent. Imagine that. You are in a thin nylon tent, outside, separated from you by less than a millimeter of fabric, is a 7-foot-tall, 300-pound predator. The hand slid down the fabric. It was testing the structure. Neil froze. He knew that if he startled it, if he screamed, the creature could shred the tent and him along with it in seconds. The creature lingered for what felt like an eternity, then turned and walked away. The encounters became more personal. Neil realized that the creatures were watching his family. He would find evidence that they had been close to the house while his children were playing. One chilling detail involves baby clothes. Neil's family had left laundry out on the line. When they went to retrieve it, items were missing, not blown away by the wind, but taken. Specifically, baby clothes. Why would a giant hairy hominid want baby clothes? Was it curiosity? Was it the scent? Or was it something more intelligent? Neil eventually wrote a book about his experiences called Fatfoot, Encounters with a Dooligahl. In it, he proposes a theory that might sound crazy to some, but to him, it was the only thing that made sense. He believed these weren't apes. Australia has no native placental mammals, other than bats and dingoes, which were introduced. He believed they were marsupials, giant bipedal wombats, or kangaroos, that had evolved to look like apes. He noted that their noses were different from apes. Their feet were different. The climax of Neil's story isn't a violent attack, but a moment of profound realization. He describes an emotional goodbye with the creature. After years of coexisting, of the creature tolerating Neil's presence and Neil tolerating the creature's intrusions, Neil felt a shift. The activity stopped. Fatfoot moved on, or perhaps died. Neil stood at the edge of the bush, looking into the trees, where he had seen the glowing red eyes so many times, and realized he missed it. He had looked into the eyes of a monster and seen an intelligence there. He had realized that we are not alone in the woods. While Neil Frost's story is a slow-burning saga, sometimes the Yowie appears with the sudden, violent shock of a car crash. Let's move to 2011, Springwood. Springwood is a decent-sized town in the Blue Mountains. It has shops, schools, and paved roads. It's not the middle of nowhere, but it is surrounded by deep gullies. A resident, let's call him Mark. His name was withheld in the official report to the National Parks and Wildlife Service, but his story was verified by researchers. Mark was out for a walk. He was on a fire trail, not far from the back of the suburban houses. It was late afternoon. The sun was casting long shadows through the gum trees. Mark had a video camera with him. He was filming the scenery, just testing out the gear. He heard a noise in the scrub to his left. A heavy, crashing sound. He swung the camera around. On the footage, which has been analyzed by researchers, you see the chaotic movement of the camera. And then, for a split second, you see it. A dark, massive figure stands up from behind, a fallen log. Mark later described the moment. He said his brain couldn't process it. He was expecting a wallaby, maybe a stray dog. What he saw was a creature covered in dark hair, standing on two legs, with shoulders that looked impossibly wide. The creature didn't roar. It didn't charge. It just looked at him. Mark didn't wait. He turned and ran. He ran until his lungs burned, scrambling up the fire trail, back towards the safety of the streetlights and the houses. When he got home, he locked the doors. He reviewed the footage. It was shaky, grainy, and inconclusive to a skeptic, but to him, it was proof. He went back the next day with a friend, armed with a tape measure and a plaster kit. They found the spot. And there, pressed deep into the clay soil, were footprints. They weren't human. They were huge, broad, and flat. The toes were splayed. The stride length between the steps was far wider than any human could comfortably manage. Mark took photos. He sent them to the MPWS. He sent them to the researchers. The sighting caused a stir in the local community. People started talking. Did you hear about what Mark saw? Yeah, my dog was going crazy that night too. It revealed the secret that every Blue Mountains resident knows but rarely speaks aloud. The bush is deep and it hides things. You can be in your backyard, grilling sausages, while 100 meters away, down in the gully, something from the Pleistocene era is watching you. I want to share one final account, one that comes from the files of the Australian Yowie Research Centre. This story encapsulates the pure, primal terror of these encounters. It happened near the Grose Valley, a place notorious for hikers going missing. A man we'll call Dave was camping alone. He was an experienced bushman. He didn't get scared of the dark. He had set up his camp near a creek, built a small fire, and was enjoying the solitude. Around 2 a.m., he woke up. The fire had died down to embers. The bush was silent. Dave lay in his swag, a heavy canvas bedroll, listening. He heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a mimic. Somewhere in the darkness, something was making a noise. It sounded like a bird, a lyrebird perhaps. Lyrebirds are famous for mimicking sounds. They can sound like chainsaws or camera shutters. But this was different. The sound was mimicking him. Dave had coughed earlier in the evening, a dry, rasping cough. Now, from the darkness came a sound. Cough, cough. But it was wrong. It sounded metallic, deep, and distorted. It was like a recording being played back at half speed. Dave sat up, grabbing his flashlight. "Who's there?" he shouted. "I've got a rifle." He didn't, but he wanted them to think he did. Silence. Then, from a different direction behind him, this time came a whistle. It was a sharp, piercing whistle, the kind a person makes to call a dog. Then, another whistle from the left. Then, a grunt from the right. Dave realized with horror that he was surrounded. There wasn't just one, there were at least 3 of them. They were circling his campsite. He scrambled out of his swag, throwing wood onto the fire, trying to get the flames up. Fire is safety. Fire is civilization. As the flames licked up, casting dancing shadows against the trees, Dave saw them. Just at the edge of the light, standing behind a thick ironbark tree, was a face. It was gray-skinned, with deep, sunken eyes that reflected the firelight with a dull red glow. It was watching him with an expression that wasn't anger, and it wasn't fear. It was curiosity mixed with predatory intent. Dave spent the rest of the night clutching his hatchet, his back to the fire, turning in circles. The creatures didn't attack. They just paced. They broke branches. They threw pebbles at him. They were toying with him. As soon as the first gray light of dawn touched the sky, the noises stopped. The feeling of being watched evaporated. Dave packed his camp in record time and hiked out. He didn't look back. He never camped in the Grose Valley again. When he told his story to researchers, he was shaking. He said, "I felt like a mouse being played with by a cat. They could have killed me at any moment, but they chose not to. They just wanted me to know that I was in their house." So, what are they? Are they a relic population of Gigantopithecus, the giant ape that lived in Asia? Did they cross the land bridge during the Ice Age? Are they, as Neil Frost suggests, a giant carnivorous marsupial that has evolved to look like a man? A killer wombat walking on 2 legs? Or are they something spiritual? The Dooligahl of the Dreamtime. Spirits that can take solid form to punish those who disrespect the land. We don't know. The Blue Mountains are vast. There are valleys there that no human has set foot in for 50 years. There are caves hidden behind waterfalls, slot canyons that go down for hundreds of meters. It is the perfect hiding place. People like Rex Gilroy spent their lives trying to prove the Yowie exists. People like Neil Frost spent their lives trying to understand them. And people like Mark and Dave just want to forget them. But the next time you visit the Blue Mountains, the next time you stand at Echo Point and look out over that endless sea of blue eucalyptus, just remember one thing. You are looking at the view. But somewhere out there, in the deep green shadows, something might be looking back at you. The Blue Mountains hide their secrets well. But as we've seen with Neil Frost and Rex Gilroy, sometimes those secrets walk on 2 legs. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, please hit that like button and subscribe to Channel 19 Mysteries for more strange tales from the fringe. Do you think the Yowie is a biological reality or something far more ancient? Let me know your theories in the comments below. I'm your host, Midnight Rider. If you have your own terrifying story or a creepy encounter you'd like to share, send it to us at mycreepyencounter@gmail.com. Until next time, stay safe out there.